Tales of Iron 2 is largely identical to the first game. There hasn't been a whole lot of elements altered aside from adding in some new locations to explore, some crafting elements, weapons, spells, and many different ways to progress through the game that doesn't feel like one huge fetch quest. It is a rat Souls-like that does a few things well, but just like the first game, it feels a little forced in certain ways that doesn't really give you a lot of choice in how you want to actually play the game due to the new element system that seems to have been inspired by games like Monster Hunter, which is going to drastically raise or lower your damage output and also apply status effects. In Tales of Iron 2, you're going to be playing as Arlo, a Warden of the North, which is probably inspired by, yeah, that series. Just like with the first game, it seems like they decided to do a copy-paste format. The story starts out with you as an heir to your kingdom that gets destroyed by the invading Darkwing army, and you want to take revenge on your father's death and bring peace to the realm. Heading out, Arlo meets with different kingdoms in an attempt to amass an army to fight back. The high point of the story was meeting with Reggie, the leader of the Rat Kingdom, because as a player that had a connection with him from the first game, it felt very personal when they band together and unite everyone in the kingdom to put a stop to the Darkwings. I'm not sure what happened, but there were some very loud and unpleasant audio layers that would randomly play during the earlier portions of the game, which I will now let you hear for yourself. If you played the first game, you're probably aware of how clunky it felt when engaging in combat alongside trying to avoid damage, while still taking damage from something you couldn't even see, and also being trapped within back-to-back knockbacks when you miss your dodge or dash. While it's a little bit more limited here, many of the features, particularly with the final fight and a few of the elite bosses throughout the journey, will leave you wondering what the hell just hit you. You are most likely hit by an effect that appeared larger than it actually physically was. This makes combat difficult since until you realize how large the skill actually is, even if you do manage to dodge out of the way in time, you are still going to receive damage from something that isn't physically on the screen right now. It's out of sync with what is actually being displayed and thus is very frustrating. Fall damage was a bit more annoying than before. No matter how careful you might have been, you could have easily been killed, especially after a difficult boss fight that left you with no juice or even health. It doesn't even matter how high you jump from, the damage will always be the same, leaving you wondering what the point of having fall damage is if it's all going to be the same. Especially if you're like me and have a habit of forgetting to manually save the game by sitting on a bench whenever you pass one. I believe it would have been less of a nuisance if the benches offered more than just manual saves. That isn't to say that it needed more systems, just a more reliable reason to actually want to sit on it. Take for example killing creatures and harvesting their resources for crafting. While yes, you can manually harvest them yourself, it just seems like an oversight. Why don't they just have items automatically enter the player's inventory? Why do they go through all of these extra steps to incorporate a system that will teleport items that you forget or purposely ignore to the previously used equipment box from the first game that is in your room when you exit the region? This makes it appear like many features and assets are being reused in convenient ways while still leaving in their old ways, even if they don't offer a whole lot of meaningful change. Acquiring your magical abilities just felt very unrewarding. Unlike with other games where you go through challenging obstacles to obtain powerful relics and power, Tales of Iron 2 just hands it to you like it's nothing. Magic is actually quite powerful and provides iframes and oftentimes doesn't do much for bosses since they are often immune to a specific element more than the rest. And getting the upgrades for them is as simple as walking through some random location and touching a stone slab. So it's best to utilize those more than your ranged weapons, since ranged weapons restrict you a whole lot when attempting to use it, which means you can't dodge or cancel out of it until you fire your weapon. This doesn't really make much sense. Many of the creatures that you're going to be fighting here are bats and flying creatures. However, with this feature, you'll be less likely to use your arrows and bullets unless the creatures you're fighting are off screen, where you can de-aggro them and kill them with no effort. So it's usually better to just wait around than risk getting caught out with it. Magic sometimes wouldn't trigger, causing you to jump towards your target rather than casting a spell and becoming immune. It just felt very clunky and not all that smooth. Elite bosses felt like they were a lot stronger than the story bosses, because of a lack of visual cue with several of their skills having higher hitboxes than they should. Basically, the difficulty will go from a 10 to a 1 and a 9 to a 4, making some fights feel very unrewarding. I want to say that there could have been a lot more use for the grapple hook, as it doesn't seem to do anything. You're given it at the start of the game by default, and it's not actually an item that you can physically use, and it's just utilized for platforming that speeds up the navigational progress, as well as being used as finishers against the Blackwings, but it's never really fully appreciated or used by the player in any meaningful way because you didn't even earn it. It feels like there's a lot of that throughout the game. Things that are put in but never fully utilized. One such example would be Dennis setting up all kinds of explosives in the room beneath the final push throughout the Darkwing Keep, and nothing really ever comes out of it. Putting the cherry on the top of issues, this may not be a big concern for most, but the way that the game narrates everything that Arlo does really feels like you're being talked down to by the narrator. When he says something so blatantly obvious that you just can't help but be slightly annoyed by, like it's constantly making the player feel like they are beyond incapable of solving the most mundane task.
Arlo's bow would make quick work of this.
Tales of Iron 2 finally incorporated fast travel, which substantially speeds up your farming and, of course, the rebuilding of your kingdom. This significantly addressed the backtracking concerns from the first game, but here's the problem. It's tied to traveling to the locations after you've helped that kingdom, so these posts will not actually be accessible until you've already gone through that entire area. So it really felt like a wasted feature, because by the time you get them unlocked, you no longer need them unless you intend to 100% the game and do every single side quest. It wouldn't have been such a big deal if they were introduced as you pass them by, or maybe even incentivize you to activate them by sitting on the bench, rather than having to double back around with the resources needed to build them. It was nice to be able to actually build them from the fast travel posts, rather than actually having to physically travel to those locations and manually do it yourself. It was definitely a good feature, but by the time you unlock it and get to it, you no longer need it. There were significant adjustments with the character's inventory and equipment management. Unlike with the first game, which concentrated solely on increasing damage by acquiring stronger weapons and better resistances for certain enemies, here you were kind of forced to acquire and to equip a various array of weapons and gear to deal with a lot of the enemies that you will encounter. And some of these changes are the ability to change your gear in the middle of combat rather than having to use the equipment box. They also added in the Monster Hunter sharpening effect and other such potions, traps, and effects that will aid you in your fights. So what this means is that if you didn't have a specific elemental weapon or resistance and you were doing next to no damage, which is labeled as such because the target you're fighting has a high resistance to that element, or you're getting one shot by them, the solution outside of get good would be to acquire the necessary equipment and to re-equip gear mid-fight. It felt like a very interesting feature if you wanted to make the game easier or harder, but it does feel like in a way kind of a forced element, when you know you could be doing better damage with the correct equipment that you don't currently have. So you'll want to keep at least 4 types of weaponry and armor so that in the end you can upgrade them to their higher tiers through the crafting menu. Surprisingly, the narrator was much more bearable this time around. It didn't feel like they were forcing themselves on a Geralt of Rivia voice, it felt more original to themselves.
With no sign of the Darkwing's return.
Visually, not much has changed in terms of design. It's very much the same as the first game. Not a whole lot of particularly noteworthy changes to make note of, outside of the fact that they did make some minor changes to make the game feel a little bit more like a dark fantasy. It appeared more like they reused many of the assets from the first game rather than creating new ones, making it feel like more of an expanded upon DLC featuring a new main character, but with gameplay that still consisted of the same startup story elements and progression. There were some new aspects that provided the player with various methods to progress, including ways to obtain gold and of course new equipment. So instead of being held at gunpoint and forced to complete every single quest that you see, you can simply sell some of your equipable items that you have while gathering resources much more faster than before. Ultimately, if you loved the first game, you're definitely going to love this one. That also being said, if you had any issues with the first game due to how things felt very clunky and unresponsive with combat, you may run into the same issues here that may prevent you from fully enjoying the experience. Tales of Iron 2 is and was enjoyable to play through despite many concerns. You're looking at least 8 hours of gameplay here to finish the main story, and many more if you do plan on exploring all of the bonus side events. They've expanded on a lot of the gameplay concepts and made the world a little bit larger, so there's much more to discover and to explore. So if you don't mind a few annoying bugs and issues such as accidentally running out of rooms and very rarely enemies running off screen or being stuck in animations, then you are going to have a very good time with the sequel.